thank you everybody for joining us today for the alternative discussion on disrupting paternalism and philanthropy presented by the Social Change Institute, which is a social enterprise of community health councils. I'm Michelle Burton. I am Chief Strategy Officer at Community Health Councils and Director of our Social Change Institute. We are really excited to take advantage of, many of us, of the time at home to bring together a cross-section of folks to have what we really see as dynamic discussions, not just sort of opportunities to learn more, but really opportunities to engage. And so today, as each of our speakers are presenting, we encourage you to go ahead and put some questions in the chat. We're going to monitor the chat. Following each presentation, we will take a few minutes to go ahead and lift up some of those relevant questions to the speakers in between. So you don't have to wait all the way to the end. We will take breaks in between each conversation so that we can engage you in a little bit of a dialogue, and then hopefully at the end of all of our presentations we'll continue that dialogue and hopefully be able to address a few more questions that people have. I just want to take some time to speak a little bit today about why we're here and talk about the conversations. So first, I want to announce, here we go. We have a save the date. So next month, we're going to have another dynamic conversation, Don't Put Me in a Box, the problem of racial categories. As we all know, that's been an issue for quite some time. As many folks may know, in other parts of the world, they don't even use racial categories, especially as they relate to social determinants of health. But here in the United States, we do. And it's problematic because the information is quite fallible. And so to kind of lift this conversation up, we're going to have Dr. David Hayes Bautista, Dr. Michael Udell, and Dr. Alice Popejoy are going to be joining us, and speaking about how do we solve for that? What are some of the other ways that we might address the problem of racial categories in science, academia, and in mainstream culture, right? So hopefully you guys will save the date for that and join us. So today, I just want to take a little bit of a moment, of course. We lost John Lewis, and that was a huge loss for many of us. But I think what is fantastic is that, John Lewis was here, to witness so many different transitions in history. And this is one of those moments in history, right? I'm part of the reason that I have hope is I've spoken to a lot of folks who are quite a bit older than myself. And they've said that this is different. And I have great confidence in the fact that they've, been on this planet for a few more decades than I have. And they've experienced, more uprisings and turmoil than I have. And they feel and see that this time, is different, that they see some movement. They see something happening that's going in the right direction. And so I think for many of us, we have to sort of hold on to that. And so I love this quote that actually Sonia, I know she's on the line, a coworker of mine, shared via a blog that was put out. And I'm sure many of us have been, scouring and reading through many of the quotes from John Lewis. But this one is I think relevant today, which is, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And so when we talk about disrupting paternalism today, that's the kind of trouble we want to get into. I think what's important is that we're in a moment, and Mauricio and I prior to today had a conversation in which he said he really feels that today he is able to have conversations in a way that he wasn't able, to before. And, and I'm going to refer to that as being unfiltered, right? Many of us in our capacities and in our jobs and in our workplaces and our lives, we are so filtered, right? We have to be very careful about what we say, when we say it, who we say it to, and how it might be perceived. And I think this is a moment where many of us feel like, you know what? No more filters right now. Right? No more filters. We want to be very real about our conversation around racial equity. We want to be very real about our conversations and how we can do better. And people are asking that, right? Across philanthropy, across, the business world, across, our public systems. folks are genuinely, I want to say genuinely and sincerely saying, we want to do something, but they're not always sure how. And so the only way that we can figure out the how is if we listen. We have to listen to what communities are saying. We have to listen to what those of us who are experiencing many of these inequities, we have to listen to people, right? You know, right now we have 22,000 people still detained in ICE camps. You know, we have federal agents arresting protesters. I mean, we are living in, you know, quite a time, but it's definitely not a time where we're going to be able to disrupt negative systems if we don't take the filters off sometimes, right? And when we take the filters off, what we're hoping is that people are listening, right? That they're listening. So I welcome you all, you know, into this conversation today. I applaud you for taking time out, you know, to listen to this conversation. And I truly, truly hope that you're able to, you know, take it back to your own communities, to your own places of work, and continue these dynamic and what I hope are positively disruptive dialogues, you know, to creating change. And so with that, I'm super excited to turn over my screen to Mauricio Miller, who is a fantastic leader that if you haven't read his book, The Alternative, I certainly hope that you take time to. I was deeply inspired by that story, deeply inspired by his work. He is the founder of the Family Independence Initiative, but he is also supporting other efforts globally with the work that he's doing that we're gonna hear and learn more about today. So Mauricio, please. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm trying to stop sharing. I couldn't find it.
Okay.
It's all yours.
Okay, let me do it again. And whoops.
That's it.
Wait, are you guys up?
Yeah, you're up. We see your screen and you should just go to your presentation.
Oh. Okay, cool. Anyway, hello everybody. It's really nice to be here. I'm Mauricio. Let's see what you should know. The book that Michelle mentioned kind of has more of a story of my life. It was sort of written off of the narrative of my learning and my moving from living in very poor communities with my mother, who was Mexican, being raised really in an all-female household, and then coming to the United States and finding that things weren't as good as we thought they could or should be in this country. And that story really led me to very early on understand that the problem had a lot to do and primarily had to do with prejudice, with racism, with sexism. And so what I'm going to go back to a little bit is that one of the things we're going to talk about is that, you know, my mother, when she came up here with my sister and I, and we were in, you know, some pretty tough neighborhoods. None of the people that we knew that moved up here, that immigrated here or were residing with us, none of us came up to live in tolerable poverty. You know, we looked at this as a land of opportunity, that it was really, your advancement was based on merit, that it was based on the talent and how hard you worked and all of that. And that in many ways that we found that it was actually much more difficult to advance in this country than we thought or than it should have been. And I guess as that should have been, which was always a challenge to me, because I'm like a super patriot. You know, this country has to be the example of equality. And I do think that, like Michelle said, we're at an inflection point. And I think this is a time when we can actually bring about another haltering step that the United States and the world makes in terms of really moving forward on equality and inclusion. I'm one of that older generation. I was, you know, my upbringing led not only from those neighborhoods, but I was first to go to college, and I, by chance, ended up at Berkeley during the 60s. It was the end of the civil rights movement and the start of the black, yellow, brown, red pride movements. This was about pride movements, and it was all about movements. And they deeply affected me. It was really clear that that issue of working together, being proud of who you are, and then working across those cultures was really a huge driving force. And so I was just really enthused. in the 60s that we were going to bring about change. Now, we had a problem because we didn't trust anybody over 60. No, actually over 30. That's right. Oh, shit. So it was a huge mistake, I think, that we made. But somehow or other, we thought, you know, we're young. This generation is going to change things, and we were going to drive it. And then I feel like what ended up happening is that we were compromised along the way. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of my experience and kind of the basics behind it. Michelle, I know everybody's kind of muted, but you can, you know, ask questions anytime along the way or for clarity. So please let me know. When my family and our neighbors were here, all that we really wanted was to participate in this country. There's so many great things about this country. We wanted to participate as equals. We didn't want special programs. We didn't want to look differently, be treated differently. We felt that we had as much talent as anybody else. We had so much to contribute. We were willing to work really hard. And somehow or other, that wasn't working out, that things were not working off of merit. And then you're trying to figure out what is the reason. And it turned out that, and my mother would say it, the biggest thing she was facing is really the racism and the sexism that she, you know, in terms of opportunities and how far she could get, it had a lot to do with how people viewed her. She actually forbade us from speaking Spanish because she realized that when she was going to job interviews, that as soon as they heard her her accent, her Spanish accent, that they were asking her where she's from. When she would say that she was from Mexico, because she only had a third-grade education, they wouldn't actually educate women, especially in that time, that when she said she was third-grade education, she was single mom and she was Mexican, the line of questioning would change. You know, the capability that people thought of her really, really changed. When she would say that her accent was from being from Spain, however, things opened up more. And so because she couldn't quite deal with all that, she came home and said, from now on, we don't speak any Spanish. I'm going to get rid of my accent. She also had so much trouble with her bosses. You know, what we're dealing with Me Too now, the standard at that point in time was that your bosses could come on to you at any time. And it just created so many obstacles to her moving ahead. And these are things that we're still dealing with. And so it was that somehow or other, these issues, we've never quite gotten over it. But in many ways, I feel like probably starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, we've glossed over them. And what is happening today on the streets is that we've glossed over too many issues. And that now is the time we're going to actually have to have those serious conversations. And you're here because you're interested in that serious conversation. The other thing I want to get across is that my biggest learnings were that there was a system in the United States that worked pretty well, but it only worked if you were already in a privileged position. So I learned about middle class and the types of choices that we were given, that people were willing to give us money and invest in us, that opportunities would open up. And that we were respected and we were seen as the ones that actually had to lead our own change. That, you know, you could hire a psychologist, but the psychologist, it would, instead of a counselor or social service worker, you would hire the people that you needed. And so it was that power that you had to lead your own change. But that power to lead your own change when you're poor and you're stereotyped just isn't there. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to try to deal with, because in many ways, then the sector that we built, which is, who was talking about the poverty industrial complex, the sector that we built is an unequal sector. It's a separate system that is unequal. And that is what I saw as we were moved into the United States in the 50s and 60s, that again, we built another system. And what all our friends wanted to do is just participate as equal partners in all this. The other thing is that for those of us that are privileged, we know that our social status, our connections, that's what actually gives us access to money. It gives us access to new ideas. It gives us access to jobs. You know, somehow or other, I became aware of it when I graduated from Berkeley. And I'd be at Berkeley and I'd tell people, yeah, I'm going to Berkeley and I've just graduated, and everybody would open up and they think I was really smart. And then I'd go back to Sacramento into my neighborhood where my family lived. And, you know, I'd go around and as I went into different places, people thought I was dumb. You know, it was just a totally different environment having to do with context and the credibility that some of our institutions give to us. Same thing happens if I got awards or whatever. I do know that credibility plays the bigger role. Our sector tends to think that it's services and training and access even to money. It's not that. It has a lot to do with the social status that you hold and the stereotypes that actually hold back so many of us. The communities I grew up in were always seen and continue to be seen as takers from society. I think those of us that are the do-gooders that want to do well, we know there's capability in those communities, but in order to get funding, we promote the fact that the families we want to help are takers, that we have to give to them. Otherwise, they won't be able to get ahead. And instead, I knew living in the neighborhoods, and then now I'm doing international work. I'm in Liberia, Colombia, you name it. And as I see what people do with almost nothing, you know, money, what, the 80% of the world's population has access to only 3% of the wealth. In spite of that, people do amazing things, but we don't think of it that way because they're not doing what we do. But we, the privileged, live in a very, very different world. And so I feel like what we need to do, and the overall message is that we have to deal with the stereotypes that our communities that we're trying to, quote, help are takers. They are actually huge contributors. And the pandemic that that we're going through still is the first time I've seen that a society has started looking at farm workers as essential, as delivery people as essential, as the janitors in the nursing homes as essential. This is the first time that I've actually seen that. And that's what we have to hang on to. It is the fact that we all are essential. Yes, you can replace many of the people in the lower bracket because we've never given them opportunities, but the fact is that we are all essential. And that stereotype of somehow or other just being charity cases has to be broken. And we that want to make a change then have to stop thinking about what is the need that we have to fill, and instead start actually putting out the fact that you do realize these communities, these families have a huge amount of capacity. The big issue for, I think, communities of color are that we are seen as takers from society when we actually are essential and we're actually makers in society. And I've learned that in Africa and some of the other work that we're doing. In terms of what's been happening in philanthropy and programs and that's some of what we're talking about this time, is that in many ways, society has tried to find ways for those that want to be helpful, like us, to, let's say, first give training and social workers, and now the new thing is to give cash. And the issue about doing all of these little adjustments to basically a top-down system is that we don't have to deal with the fact that there is a power dynamic where we're in power and the families that are actually makers in the society, that somehow or other they cannot lead their own change. And as long as we're in a power situation and we're not willing to actually attack our own power and overthrow that, then we'll find ways to adjust to it. And the latest one is really to give cash. Now that's been happening for what, over 2 decades of conditional and unconditional cash transfers, and those have not changed the attitude towards low-income communities. So it is not really just about cash. And then it becomes, if it's not about cash and it's about perceptions, and the perceptions that keep people like my family and whatever from getting the right opportunities and the access to dollars that come from the status of that, then what we have to decide is, are we going to take that issue on? And one of the papers that I wrote is really about there not being a middle ground anymore. And that is the point of inflection that we're at. You either have to fight that racism and fight that power structure and actually confront it. And if you don't, if you just add to the adjustment, then all that you're doing is being either complicit, or you're hiding natural talent, or you're adding to the racist type of dynamics that actually feed the white supremacists and the Nazis saying, oh, those people are just takers. They want things from us all the time. What we're going to have to do is go to what people do themselves. And I can tell you, in these neighborhoods I've worked in, Liberia, Colombia, Mexico, the Philippines, people are always doing something, and they do work together. It's all counter to the stereotypes. This was in West Oakland, where people were building their own community. Would the foundations give them any money? No, nothing like that. Unless they formed a 501c3 that was respected by the powers that be, those families that were self-organizing were not going to get anything. So what we're going to have to do is change how we work and what we do. And one of the biggest lessons I had was when I first started FII, we started working with the UMN community. And with the UMN community, we started collecting data on what they wanted to do. And as we saw that they were doing kind of amazing things, they built their own community center. They wanted to get a van to bring their elders and whatever. And so what we did is we offered them money. And one of the things we offered is to pay for a van. And the people there, the district leaders, because it was more of a collective leadership, said, no, we don't want your money. We'll take 40% of the money, because what has to happen is our families have to contribute. Now their families, 70% were on welfare, but they were collecting basically $25 from families. And they said, if our families aren't the primary contributors, they won't own the solution. They won't own the van. Same thing happened when Dreamers came to New Profit is one of the big funders. And when the Dreamers came and presented all the actions, because that was when the protests were going on around Dreamers, then a foundation person at the end said, well, then how can we help you? What can we do to help you, what you're doing? And the person that was leading that presentation says, well, you know, we'll let you know. We can't assume that we're the center or that we're so necessary. What we need to understand is that these folks that are doing this need the recognition, and they need to know that it's under their power that we can come into their dreams. So essentially that I feel like we have to confront the system that we've created that creates our jobs for us. It makes it really difficult for people to accept this. There are ways of doing that. I feel like we have to give choice and control back to the families. We've talked about that for ages. This type of approach is really based on actually honoring what has happened historically, which is whether it was Greenwood, which was the Black Wall Street just celebrated on Juneteenth in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that the capacity to build even microeconomies is within these communities, and that they have a lot of energy that actually can lead the change. And what we need to do is learn how to follow that. There are different applications that can happen. I'm not going to talk about them here, maybe in some question and answer. There is another workshop next week. If you contact me, I can let you know. That'll have more detail on how we're actually doing some of this work. And I do feel like I want to challenge all of you. This is the 60s in Berkeley. This is where I got my political upcoming realization on this whole thing. And I do think now it's going to take another generation. And so if we want to be part of that generation, we're going to have to do it differently. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so we can stop sharing the screen for now, Mackenzie. And let me take a look here and see if we have some questions. Let's see here. Okay, so far, I don't see any questions yet. Are there any questions from folks? If you have a question, you can add it to the chat. But while you're doing that, I certainly do have a question. So Mauricio, thank you very much for that presentation. I could see a lot of head nodding happening as you were making your points with regards to the inherent value that's in our communities, and how those of us who have been, I know I've been working in the nonprofit sector for 27 years and have come to the realization in the last few years that, you know, I'm not having the impact that I would like to have. And I've read much of the literature around the poverty industrial complex and really trying to figure out, you know, how can we work differently? And social enterprising has been one of my solutions to that, right? How do I now move from being a traditional fundraiser into helping organizations, you know, create access to capital for their organizations and for the communities that they're in. So as you're doing, your work, I know you have your community independence initiative now. Could you actually talk a little bit about how you're doing that work today?
Yeah, I feel like one of the, hey, I'm open. One of the big issues is still that there is no recognition of the contributions that people in these communities make. And FII was originally set up that that's what it was supposed to do. It was going to highlight a lot of what's already there and happening and say, look at, there's tons of things and go fund those things. Like that Village Bottoms, that Black New World and whatever that you said, that was all self-organized. Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to direct investments and funding to those self-organized issues. And, after a while, you get a lot of pressure. And what it is like people in our sector want structure, organization. They see accountability very differently than I see. And so then, what ends up happening is a lot of the efforts got compromised. And so one of the things I felt is that people, even though I think FII continues to have really great data, that the contributions being made in the neighborhoods in the US compared to a macro economy just weren't showing up. So what I decided to do was go internationally, and we went to Liberia, where essentially everything is being built by the families themselves. After 2 civil wars, Ebola, and now COVID, that the government is dysfunctional, NGOs are dysfunctional, aid is certainly dysfunctional, and yet you don't see people actually starving to death. And what they've done is they're building their own economy from the ground up, but they have no investment and no wealth. And so we went there and asked them, okay, so what are you doing? And then it's like, well, can we be of help? What would you need? And what ended up happening is they said, well, yeah, you can help us in several ways. And one of them is that they knew that there's investment systems for privileged kids. I was just teaching at Princeton, and there are 2 dedicated venture capital funds aimed at graduates, at these 22-year-olds. For their ideas. Then there's actually, I'm on a committee this summer that is providing advice to them. None of that exists for all of the business people in Liberia and all these other countries. And so they said, we just want to be able to build what our visions are. And so that's sort of what we're experimenting with them. We basically, okay, you show us, you have profiles, show us what you want to do, and we're going to try to tie you in with other people that want to see your society grow. And the thing is that in Liberia, it is so small that if we impact and basically get about anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 of these petty vendors that are in these districts actually growing their businesses, it'll impact that entire district, because there is a ripple effect that happens. So Liberia basically is what we're going to do, is try to change the economy within 2 districts in Liberia, basically by setting up a venture capital and a recognition fund and doing social networking with the diaspora from Liberia. Similar things are happening in Colombia, Mexico, the Philippines, and there's some other countries that we might go to.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Mauricio. Thank you. I think that what's always fascinating to me is, much of the economic development models we see in developing countries like Liberia, and the sort of program that you're establishing and promoting there are highly applicable, to many of our communities here in the United States. But it's, like I said, it's baffling to me how we don't adopt them. So somehow we don't see these models as being applicable to our first world problems, because we're first world. So some might think it could be our arrogance, that somehow we can't apply it, apply something we're doing in developing countries here. But the truth is they're highly transferable. So thank you for that. One question from Bambi about how to position themselves for conversations with funders as a trans-led organization that is supporting the trans community. And, interestingly, I think there actually have been conversations within Southern California grant makers around supporting the trans community. So I just wanted to, let you know that I've given you my email, and I'd love to reach out and talk to you more about how to make sure that we can access some of those conversations for you.
In addressing that question, I do think one of the dilemmas we have is with philanthropy, that it wants silos, it wants all of this other stuff. And I think to get immediate funding, you have to comply. You have to be the giver. You have to tell them what you're going to give to the trans community, to whatever community it is. And however, this is a period where you could challenge them. It's like, you know, we're not the ones that are going to give. We are self-organized. We should have the resources to do what we feel. I think this is really a period of time when you can challenge philanthropy. I know that I'm going to be involved in, you know, with the Bridge Span group. We are going to be going after funders to really start changing how they look at communities, and that they look at the fact that you already have your agendas, not to meet need, but actually to do whatever it is to advance your community. And so the issue of changing from a needs-based to somehow an asset-based approach of strengths actually should be fundable.
We don't have a lot of questions yet. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and transition us to Jesus. Jesus is the current CEO of the Family Independence Initiative. What I love about having Mauricio and Jesus with us is that, you know, I want to make a comment about Stephen Hawking, because I loved Stephen Hawking. And what I loved about him was that he was this brilliant mind, but he was a disruptor. And the reason he was a disruptor is he was always willing to admit that, you know, even though he had a theory or an idea, if he discovered that he found something better, he was so ready to say, you know what, that was great, but now I'm going to do this because I think it's better. And so, you know, in my conversations with Mauricio and Jesus, I've seen that. So Jesus is left with, you know, an early version of Mauricio's brilliance and how he wanted to bring attention to the value of communities. And it's still worthwhile. He, of course, still supports the Family Independence Initiative, but he's clearly moved on to seeing how he can affect change, you know, in other ways, in other places. But the foundation of the work he's doing is very representative in the Family Independence Initiative. And so I wanted to bring Jesus on so that you all would have an opportunity to see, you know, that progress, and to hear about the very important work they're doing today, especially in a moment where unconditional cash transfers are certainly not the solution to the poverty industrial complex. I think we all agree with that. But in times of disaster, I'm going to say the 3-letter word, universal basic income is sort of a hard topic to avoid right now, right? Because we're in a moment where, you know, we're fighting for the hashtag extra 600 for unemployment. And really people are fighting for that because it's one of the only forms of compensation on the table that is going to solve for the lack of unemployment and the lack of income that people are experiencing right now in this disaster. So Jesus, please, it is your turn to take over the screen.
Excellent. Well, hopefully y'all can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. And also the added bonus of having Mauricio on here is I usually talk a little bit about the beginnings of FII and how it works, and having him be able to cover that makes hopefully my end of the presentation jump right into the work. But one thing that I will mention as we talk about the beginning of this work, as I put up our vision and mission up here, it's really was centered always in thinking about the community-wide impact, as Mauricio mentioned, what people are able to and are on a day-to-day basis demonstrating for themselves. How do we put focus back on that and invest in it directly? And that to us continues to be critical. And even as we are evolving our work, we really have centered it and continue to center it around the 3 basic values of community, of investing directly in them through unconditional cash transfers, as well as eliminating the paternalistic approach, but that choice back in people's hands and recognizing the power of their community. Why we do that is we have built a deficit-based system for 50+ years to address the war on poverty that has been happening since the mid-60s. And one of the important points is that for 50+ years, the problem has not gotten any better. And actually certain markers, what we see is that the problem is worse. When it comes to child poverty, we've seen an increase there, as well as a couple other indicators. That deficit-based system is $400 billion a year strong. 90% of that is in government, 10% of that is in philanthropy, as well as it's always about punishing people for doing well, about professional services, not recognizing necessarily what people do for themselves, and there's no trust. So just quickly, our deficit-based system is missing the initiative that is happening. The latest census study shows that of the 50 million Americans at or below the poverty line, within a 4-year period of time, 75% of them will actually move above that line in that period of time. And then within 5 years, 50% will fall back in. And that is indicative of creativity, ingenuity, and hard work that is happening in spite of that deficit-based system that we've been describing. What is happening is that people cannot sustain it because it's not being looked for, it's not being invested, and as well as there is no resources available for people to be able to match those efforts. What that means is, in addition to that, is that there's the way that we punish people, the cliff effects that are happening for those who are working poor. And we just use this as a quick example. Is like if you're making $17 or $16.50 an hour and you get about $1 raise and are receiving childcare subsidies, essentially the safety net, because of that lack of trust, because it's meant to not invest in people, you lose out in about $12,000 a year of investment. And there's no replacing that. There's no other system that exists that says, great job, keep going. Unlike what we do for the wealthy, right? Which is we built all these ways that as people are building their assets, we match those efforts through tax policy mainly to be able to increase their wealth. And so what we're doing in our approach, going back to the very beginning of this work, as I mentioned before, is a strength-based approach. It's about direct investment. It's about the power of community and putting that agency back in people's hands. And the way that we're accelerating and scaling that work is through our online platform called Up Together, which centers around the exchanges of that financial and social capital. And so we have two main audiences for that platform. First, on the member side, these are the hardworking, low-income individuals across the United States. If you were to define them, they're around the 50 to 150% of the federal poverty line, not in active crisis. And that mainly means that if you are facing homelessness or addiction or some other crisis in your life, that's what you're centering your life around, not necessarily pursuing other goals, as well as to be able to have access to some sort of technology to share information with us, as well as to easily receive the cash from us through our platform. And I'll share a little bit more of what that looks like. On the other side, the platform can easily bring on philanthropic, government, and partners from the academic sectors on the philanthropic and government end, so that they can provide direct unrestricted capital and invest directly in the individual households that we're working with. On the academic side and on the other two sectors, we're lifting and pipelining that data back so that we're growing the strength, the visibility of the strength of these communities and changing the narrative from that perspective. And our work is not to create an institution that lasts for decades. It's really to be able to demonstrate this and lift the evidence that it works, bring along philanthropy to a certain degree so that we can change government in the long run in the way that this operates. And I'll just share like a quick example of that. Actually, through our work in Massachusetts and Boston, we were able to get quickly within 5 years, and that's how I started my work within the organization, in engaging a number of philanthropic partners there, and grew to 1,000 households, lifted the impact of what they were able to do within 2 years, which you can see the data on the screen. And as a result of that, began to get the city and the state paying attention to the shortcomings of this deficit-based model that they had been supporting, and the inability to bring around that community-wide change. And as a result of that, the state of Massachusetts is partnering with us in a collaboration to be able to demonstrate what our strength-based approach does against our traditional deficit-based thinking. And in that work, we brought in an evaluation team from Harvard University so that we're doing a randomized control trial to bring that scientific evidence to bear so that other municipalities can follow suit just as well. And the promise is there that if we are able to prove this out, they can adopt this statewide, not just in the city of Boston. And how we have worked prior to COVID, and I'll come back to where we're at right now and how we're going to get back here, is it's really simple. As members join, they are tracking their progress as they self-identify goals, as well as are connecting and selecting groups that they want to participate in of people around their community. We are learning directly as they're sharing data, how they're pursuing those goals for themselves and for members of their households. We're also then creating unrestricted cash investment back to them that they get to choose how they can use, and then sharing that information back so again we can continue to grow and build this evidence to the point that Up Together continues to be a place of support for philanthropy, but obviously we believe that government can easily take this on and grow it on their own terms long term. Now, since March, as COVID hit, one of the things that we felt an opportunity for, as a number of partners called us, the city of Chicago, the city of Austin, and the United Way in Detroit, who had funded projects and demonstrations there, as to, they saw that there was going to be a great need to be able to invest directly in people who were losing jobs and were being negatively affected by the pandemic and the economic crisis. And we had just been on the process of evolving our platform once again and being able to reach a scale. And so we adapted that to be able to support those partners in distributing dollars directly to families based on our strength-based approach. So they would continue to be able to connect and support and build community with one another and strengthen those connections, as well as receive unrestricted cash investments or just cash at this time, as they were trying to make ends meet while losing jobs or the rent being increased or basic needs mounting. And so we launched with a philanthropic partner, the Stand Together Foundation, the Give Together Now campaign, with just a modest goal of $10 million into our 10 base sites. Since March, late March, we just crossed over the $100 million threshold and raising dollars. And you can just see here by regions. And this is again indicative of philanthropy and government recognizing that the best resource to overcome this moment of crisis is already on the ground. It's people, it's community. And you can build huge infrastructure to try to get food to people, or because of a lack of trust, pay people's rent directly to a landlord, or you can just give them cash and really invest directly in their ability to create solutions for themselves through this process. I would also add that, this is also indicative of a lack of action from our federal government and leadership in really being able to address the crisis that is unfolding all around us. So as amazing as our team has been in being able to do this work and deploying this much capital across all 50 states, it's unfortunate that they can't figure out a way to get out of their own way and being able to recognize and invest in people and what they can do for themselves. And one of the things that we've done is really simplify the way that people can connect with us. So what you're seeing are just mock-ups of our Up Together platform. We've been also able to leverage community connections, and whether it's with a community organization, a church, neighborhood group, individuals, or nonprofits, where they can easily meet with individuals either by phone or by video and verify that they've been impacted by the pandemic, and then they simply just receive a code that brings the individuals up to our platform as you see here. They give us their email or phone number, and then, or they can also sign in with Google or Facebook, share some basic information as well as the code that they've received, and within 1 or 3 business days are able to receive either direct deposit into the bank accounts, a one-time $500 payment on average, or they can get a prepaid card, an up-together card that we distribute either through email or physically, which takes 3 to 5 days. If by email, it's done within 1 business day. And the advantage of what we've been able to do, and we continue to be called on by actually now a lot of municipalities, is again, because there's a lack of leadership in what's happening inside of the federal government. A number of municipalities are using their CARE dollars to be able to drive dollars directly to people, as well as to drive dollars directly to people who are facing eviction or are behind on their rent and their mortgage. And then in addition to that, we're able to essentially, through those community connections, we don't have to filter for whether or not you have a social security number or documented. So we've been able to set up a number of undocumented funds in California and Texas and Massachusetts, where the most vulnerable who are not benefiting from traditional federal aid can continue to receive dollars and find a way to become, again, to make ends meet as best as possible, even though we all know $500 is really a drop in the bucket to the crisis that many are facing. We've also are in the process and should have an impact report coming out as to those dollars that we've been able to deploy as we pause our traditional work. But just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of who are we reaching and what we're learning. So we have about 76% of the folks are people of color. Most, 3/4 of them are making less than $35,000 a year. Close to 80% are parents, 82% with kids under the age of 18. 2/3 of them have not received any other relief, and about half of them don't expect to receive anything. And so it's really just, it's both a demonstration of what is happening on the ground, but then also our ability to, even though we're getting about a 10% survey return rate of learning, but it helps us to really get a good understanding of what's happening on the ground and sharing that learning with others. I think with that, I will stop and bring it back to you, Michelle.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Bina. Bina is conducting an amazing study around how cash transfers impact maternal and infant health, which we all know is a huge issue, in communities of color, especially for African-American women, as our numbers are just, they haven't changed in 200 years as it relates to infant and maternal health and mortality. So Bina is with she's a senior researcher with the Federal Reserve. I've promised not to ask her any compromising questions. Wink, wink. So she is certainly in a position of influence with regards to her work, but she is also, no matter where she is, representing the Federal Reserve. So we do appreciate her taking the time to be with us today and presenting some of the research that she's doing. I think it provides sort of a great case study, which is a great kind of a juxtaposition to the rest of our conversation, which is much more global. So I really appreciate being able to have her share, her work with us today. So Bina, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm gonna see if I can share my slides here. All right. So as Michelle mentioned, I work at the SF Fed in community development. Well, first of all, I want to thank Michelle and Mauricio and Jesus also. It's great to be part of this dynamic and so important and relevant conversation. So thank you for bringing this together. So I work in community development at the SF Fed, and our vision is for a healthy and inclusive economy in which all people can participate and no one is left behind. And in order to reach that aim, we conduct research and we foster strategic partnerships to remove barriers for economic opportunity, especially for low-income communities and communities of color. So today, as Michelle alluded to, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research basis of cash to improve health outcomes, particularly at birth, and to reduce racial health inequities. So I need to start with the standard Fed disclaimer that these views are my own and not necessarily those of the Fed system or the SF Fed. So here on this first slide, I'm going to show some data going back to 1990. Preterm birth rates in the US are really high. 1 in 10 babies is born early, and really compared to other developed countries, we're doing pretty horribly. We're like 19 out of 19 in a recent study of comparable countries. And there's also these really alarming and persistent racial health inequities. So the blue line represents preterm birth rates for Black pregnant people, and the bottom line in green is white pregnant people. And so this has been continuing over time. So the thing about this is that it's not driven by individual behaviors or access to healthcare. We've done a lot better in improving prenatal care, giving people interventions to, eat better and so on, and that has not really budged this. I want to just draw a line from this stat to economic well-being on the whole. The reason that at the Federal Reserve we care about this is because if we leave behind the potential of communities of color, we are not going to be able to achieve our best shared economic prosperity. And so it's really, we see it as part of our mandate for maximum employment. We need to address racial inequities in order to have the best, highest functioning economy we can. And we also know that the costs of preterm birth are $26 billion a year, that this is a really important health and economic issue. So what is going on here? Why is it that we haven't been able to budge this inequity? And the reason this is a complex question is because babies are not blank slates. Like as we know more about health and how it develops over time, we understand that people's opportunities and experiences over their lifetime are really what shape their health outcomes. And especially things that happen in utero, early childhood, adolescence, those things have impacts even decades down the road. But the thing that we often don't contextualize is that these things are happening in the context of our household, but also our broader neighborhood. And really, we have to think about the institutions and policies that have shaped our neighborhoods and our context. So a person's home when they're a child, the street on which they played, the neighborhood in which they grew up in, and what was in that neighborhood is really a product of institutions and policies over time. And really, broadly, structural racism has shaped those policies and those neighborhoods, and therefore our health. So here's just a few examples. I won't go through all of these, but in the past, maybe 100 years, here are a few recent examples of the ways that structural racism is at the root of residential segregation, economic inequities, and poor health. So looking back at redlining practices that started in the 1930s that really systematically denied access to capital and wealth building opportunities for communities of color, especially Black people. And then also even more recently looking at racial targeting of subprime loans. As we know in the most recent, in the housing crisis in the last recession, that was a huge reason that communities of color lost wealth, was because of this racial targeting. So that's what I mean when I say babies are not blank slates. Babies have our history in their biology. So this history of racialized policies and practices, of unfair advantage, of discrimination, this is all in our biology, and it's passed through generations. So while we know more and more that pregnancy is a really critical time period in the development of our health, data also suggests that this is a time period of a lot of income volatility. So on average, households experience a 10% decline in income during pregnancy. and over 40% for single mothers who live without other adults. So think about that in terms of the stress that it creates on individuals when they're pregnant. And think about that in terms of the long arm we know of what happens in these critical time periods of development. So wealth plays an important role in weathering income volatility. And that slide that I showed previously, we know that there are reasons that there's a racial wealth gap. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by wealth. Wealth, in the technical definition is assets minus liabilities, but really what wealth represents is the ability to weather crises, to invest in oneself, to plan for the future, and really the ability to take a breath and have a little pause instead of continuously dealing with crises in front of you. So it's basically the antidote to toxic stress, to the dysregulation of the stress response that we know is responsible for premature aging, poor health, really for understanding how social determinants of health get in the body. So I want to dig a little bit into some of the data behind this wealth disparity to kind of hammer this point home. So here's the slide that shows the racial wealth gap, the Black-white wealth gap over time. You can see in 1998, African-American or Black households had 18.8% of the wealth of white households, and that this has declined such that in 2016, it's actually 10%. Also, what you can see on this slide, I need to move my little Zoom video so I can see it. The share of zero or negative wealth has resulted in the most recent data, 2016, we see that over a quarter of Black households have zero or negative wealth. I've got to move my Zoom window again, sorry about that. And so just getting again to this point that income is not the same as wealth. In white households, on median, white people have 210% of their income as wealth, while in Black or African-American households, that's 39.3%. And it's important to note that this racial wealth gap is wide at every level of income, age, education, marital status. This is really critical. None of these factors actually protect us from the racial wealth gap. So then I want to talk a little bit about income shocks. So these data, the blue line here shows white respondents and the green line shows Black or African-American respondents. So what you see here is that Black households have more income shocks, have a higher risk of income shocks, and fewer resources to weather them. So less ability to borrow from friends and family, and more need to dip into savings in an emergency or postpone payments or become delinquent. And this is not driven, again, by individual behavior. In fact, on this slide, you can see that Black or African-American respondents are more likely to be saving for an emergency. So I just want to sum this up. Due to a history of racist policies and practices, Black households face greater income volatility and fewer options to weather it. And just bringing this back to this point of pregnancy and early childhood, we have to intervene during this time period to reduce toxic stress and to sort of support us breaking the cycle of health inequities. So what can we do about it? The example I'm going to share is clearly not enough. Wealth policy is really critical. There's a lot that needs to be done. And as Mauricio was saying, cash is not the answer to everything. We have to really address systematic racism on multiple levels. But I'm really excited to share this one example of one way to improve intergenerational health by providing financial stability during pregnancy, and it's called the Abundant Birth Project. This project is led by a group out of the San Francisco Department of Public Health called the Expecting Justice Project, and they're focused on reducing preterm birth inequities for Black and Pacific Islander women in San Francisco, and that's where, driven by the data, where we see the poorest birth outcomes in the city. And so this group really was thinking originally about addressing housing instability. And in terms of thinking about, the time it would take to build a housing intervention, the complexity of the housing arena, we quickly pivoted to thinking about cash. We thought, well, cash can be a housing intervention. It could also be a food intervention. It could be really you know, whatever it needs to be. And it kind of builds that sense of trust that people can figure out what they need for themselves. So this over here on the right, this image from Facebook is an example of a flyer that's being sent around. So the group hired a group of community researchers to talk to women and other pregnant people who've been pregnant in the community, to understand how they would want cash delivered, what additional supports they would want, what could be unintended consequences, and really kind of understand this arena more. And just building on Mauricio's point that the solutions are really in communities, and we should really be you know, having folks from the community designing and implementing this intervention. Just say a little bit more about this. The idea, so this project is going to reach 100 Black and Pacific Islander pregnant people in San Francisco. It's intended to roll out in November after this community research phase. And the goal is to distribute a monthly income of $700 to $1,000 a month during the duration of somebody's pregnancy, and then 2 months afterward, with the intention of growing that out to 2 years after birth. And I encourage you to go to their website, expectingjustice.org. I'm on their steering committee, and I've been an advisor to the Abundant Birth Project, and there's a lot more information there that you could look at. So just looking at some of the evidence behind this intervention, we have a lot of evidence from international context on cash transfers, as well as from US studies on the earned income tax credit, showing improvements in health and reductions in poor birth outcome. Also, I want to highlight this one study out of Manitoba, Canada, that found a reduction of 17.5% in preterm birth from small amounts of cash that were given monthly. And that's a really significant number because preterm birth has been a mystery largely. We have not been able to figure out what is going to drive improvements in this racial inequity. So it's a huge improvement through small amounts of cash. Here's some of the logic behind this concept. The idea is to reduce stress, give people the ability to plan for the future and have a sense of control, and improve material circumstances. And the idea here is that this could be, as I was saying earlier, housing intervention, food intervention, a mental health intervention, really with the idea that it will improve maternal and infant outcomes. I want to talk for a minute about this idea of sense of control. So this is a slide that represents data from a series of studies called the Whitehall studies from the UK that were conducted in the 1980s by an epidemiologist, Sir Michael Marmot. And what they looked at was people who were employed in the British civil service, and they were graded along these 4 grades. Administrative were people at the very top of the organization, followed by professional executive, clerical, and other, which were people like bicycle messengers and other staff. And what they found was that the higher you go up the grade, the lower your mortality. And you kind of expect that, like, people who are at the top have the best health, people who are at the bottom have the poorest health. What was really interesting about this is that the pattern held for every level in between, and that this held across multiple health outcomes and over time. And since these studies, it's been replicated in various contexts internationally, elsewhere in this country, and across many other health outcomes. And this gradient in health just holds across all these different contexts. And really what researchers came to realize is it comes down to this idea of control over one's destiny, the ability of people to deal with the forces that affect their lives, even if they decide not to deal with them. And I think that that's really important, the idea of that trust that people can deal with it or not deal with it. They can choose. That's what's really underlying this social gradient. So in this way, I really think of cash as more than money. It creates this ability for people to control their destiny. It creates a sense of dignity and belonging and connectedness, trust, hope, aspiration, safety. And I want to point out that, in the ways that we built our social safety net, none of these things have really been central. This is the pillars of well-being from the Prevention Institute. And regardless of what the intervention is, I think that these are the things we need to be building and driving for. And also, as Mauricio said, it's not necessarily like cash will bestow this if it's given in that culture of stigma. And so how do we, as practitioners, as funders, how are we thinking about all of these factors in the development of our interventions? So with that, I'm just going to leave you with the question, you know, we all have a role in creating a healthy, inclusive economy. And I always want to ask people with this question, what is your role? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bina. That was great. And before we move back, just a quick question that was asked is there a similar project in LA that you know of?
Not that I know of. I would love to hear about it if others know. I put my contact information on that slide, and you can tweet at me as well. I would like to do more to lift up projects like this, because I think they are important examples of, you know, how we could be moving forward in our approaches.
Excellent, excellent, fantastic presentation. We actually have several really good questions in the chat, and so I want to take a moment to sort of open that up. And I'm going to come back here. People are sharing some great stuff too with each other, so let's keep that sharing up. So one of the questions is around how these strategies and initiatives challenge the long-standing global economic system of racial capitalism, and that's from Pastor Kelvin Sauls, who's a long-standing activist and worker in South LA, and hails originally from South Africa. So he's got quite a global experience as it relates to racial capitalism. So I know that that's where his question's coming from, but I'll open it to our panel. Who would like to respond to that?
I'm sorry, where is the question?
So it's
Okay.
in the chat, I'll repeat it. How do these strategies and initiatives challenge the long-standing global economic system of racial capitalism?
Okay, I'll comment on that. I feel very strongly that giving, whether it's through aid or philanthropy, is just not the answer. It's a nice thing to do, but it doesn't change the stereotype. It doesn't really build off of people's initiative. It is not what people in privileged positions would think would change their life. That what we need to do is actually include our folks, because I feel like, because of my family, I'm still part of that, that what we need to do is actually have a system that includes in how rich people and privileged people get ahead, which is not universal basic income. You know, what we have is for those who are in privileged position, and whether you're in Africa or whatever, what there is not is actually an investment system base that lets us build our businesses, lets us build our scholarships, lets the people do it. So just distributing cash or distributing social workers or training is just not it. And so the system has to actually invest in contributions the families are making, not because they're needy, but because they are contributing. And that's the data that is not missing. So I've seen this data for 40 years in my work. I've seen the needs-based data. And to be honest with you, it hasn't changed that much. So unless we change our practices and basically let people build their economies in the way we build it, you know, privileged people have venture capitalists, angels, they have, you know, Trump has his dad give him $25 million. You're introduced into social networks, you're included in a privileged society. And it is that needs to change, not any other, not benefits from us. We got to change this us and be able to follow them.
Great, thank you for that, Mauricio. So we've got a few minutes left, and you know, you guys aren't talkative. I keep thinking, like, you go to YouTube or Twitter, people are just firing away because I think because it feels anonymous. This doesn't feel so anonymous, right? We know who you are and what questions you're asking. I also find that when we start to have these really critical conversations around you know, subjects like paternalism and equity and disrupting it. It's not a conversation all of us are used to having in our day-to-day workplaces, right? Or in our day-to-day lives. And so I know that, you know, I've faced this before where folks are just sort of like, wow, this is great. And they don't even know where to begin with sort of the questions or contributing, because we don't have generally the license or the freedom to have these conversations. And so what I enjoy about this is that, you know, what we've heard today is that there's no magic bullet, right? There's no magic bullet to the problem of longstanding systemic, you know, racial and other isms that are happening globally. And that, you know, we know Band-Aids aren't going to be it. I think you heard very clearly from Bina and Jesús that, you know, helping people who need help right now is important. Somebody walks into the emergency room and they're bleeding out. You don't ask questions. You do what you can to stop the bleeding. And that is what so many of us have done for so long. And what Mauricio is bringing to the table is saying, look, he's not against, you know, taking care of these immediate, you know, situations, but it's not enough. You know, there's a lot of money in philanthropy. There's a lot of money, you know, that exists in this world, and we're basically keeping it. You know, the power system is keeping, you know, all families from the ability to access it, and that is because of longstanding, you know, racism and inequities that have to be challenged and they have to be disrupted so that we can get to a place, you know, where we aren't, you know, being a part of this codependent, you know, deficit-based system, but rather, you know, and recognizing the inherent value in all of our communities and in all of the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. And I know I, for one, want to see the impact, you know, that for many of us decades we've been doing. So one of the questions we have is, how do you think we could build a project similar to Up Together that is collective and includes sectors that could align and make real change locally? What's the difference between universal income and what Up Together is doing? So let's go with the first question about if there's a way to take a project like Up Together, I guess, and infuse it with some of the principles that Mauricio was speaking to. Is that possible? I tend to think that that's, in a way, a little bit of what FII was supposed to, or really started off as.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious as to what other sectors, but right now we have been able to sort of in the Health and Human Services sector, if you were to use that umbrella, pretty much both by bringing community and letting them do, and really catering to them in the way that they are supporting and connecting and strengthening connections with one another. And then the way that we're then shifting policies and practices in government as a result of that. I feel like that is aiming to be able to do that, and it's meant to be able to be brought inside of any community. But also would love to hear, well, I'm sure others have thoughts, how else we can improve it, being able to do that, or what lessons can we share so that others can replicate it?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. So what I tend to do is try to mimic the privilege that I have as a privileged person in this society, because I am privileged. You know, I'm Hispanic, but I do know that I have privileges of social status. And what I found in terms of what we should look at and mimic is watching people that just take privilege for granted and how they are going to go about solving problems. I ran into essentially the people that built the internet, Vincent Cerf and all those folks. And what they have gotten into is that the internet right now has been used by the Googles and the Facebooks and whatever to basically extract information and make money off of it. And that the original intent was to bring us together on this issue of mutuality. So they were in the process of building a platform where people of privilege actually could come together, somewhat like Up Together, but it would be a place where there would be a repository of all of their information, AI, climate change, whatever, that people could share, and that we could make more progress if we work together as opposed to extracting it. And then they ran into my work in Liberia and Colombia and whatever, And it was, well, our folks, the families in Liberia want to talk to the families in the Philippines and want to connect and want to. And so essentially then we've become the alpha of that platform that they were building. And that what it is going to be basically an open system where people can come together, share information, share financing, basically network. And it's up together, but it's open source and it's on any subject. You could do AI, climate change. You could be people in poverty in one country and connect with people in another country. So there is actually a lot of organizing going on and collaborations going on right now, trying to address the issue of, look at, I think our countries have gotten to be so exploitative that we have to set up a whole other system that is really about people working together, about mutuality. And so that is the sector that I think we need to really focus on and build.
Thank you, Mauricio. And, you know, we're right at time. I think this has just been a fantastic conversation. I really want to thank Bina and Mauricio and Jesus for joining us and really sharing their wisdom and the work that they're doing. And more importantly, challenging all of us. You know, we need to have critical conversations about solutions and really hold our systems accountable to doing things differently. We cannot have more of the same. This is the moment to do it in. So please do, you know, continue to join us in these conversations. We'll have more panel series. You know, we look forward to hearing from you guys in the future. And we will be sharing out the slides if you haven't gotten them already. So again, thank you so much to our speakers. And thank you everyone for taking time to join us today.
Thank you all. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.